Hello, and welcome to another episode of Talk on Things and Stuff. So, today we're going to revisit the issue of rapid onset gender dysphoria and the experiences that parents of kids that experience this phenomenon have, kind of seeing the changes that happen in their children as they start to internalize and manifest some ideas that they get exposed to in the world. Um, One unique resource that is available to kind of help understand what may be going on in the lives of individuals who go through that process is found in a document that was created a couple of years ago by somebody who is a self-described detransitioner, somebody who went through the process of feeling disconnected and out of sync with their gender and their body and their experience in the world, and in reflection wanted to find some way to communicate what it is that may be the reason that girls in particular have a really hard time reconciling with the changes that happen in their body, the way that society interfaces with women and girls, and just to kind of perhaps give some explanatory power to that. So let me see if I can share this in our resources here. We'll go to share screen and we'll bring up, let's see here. Yeah, here we go. Okay, so if you go to formerly Twitter, now X.com, and you search for Reality Girl Zine, then it's just at Reality Girl Zine, Zine, with the at sign there. You'll find the source of this particular document. It's pinned at the top of their page, which is "Why are so many girls deciding they'd rather be boys?" And it's a thread of about 16 images that goes one by one through each of the different experiences. And I thought this was just a phenomenal resource. It was early in my own journey trying to understand this issue. One of the things that I did is listen to as many detransition stories as I could find, just to see from the other side what people were thinking as they were going into that ideological space that ultimately resulted in a bunch of different choices that they made for themselves and their bodies that they later regretted and backed away from, and then reflected on what it was that led them to make those decisions. And so the art style is really unique. It kind of has a crayon drawn art style, and I thought it would be fun to create a video version of this. And so I did kind of a test and contacted the author, and they liked what they saw and said it would be fine for me to go ahead and do that. And so what I'd like to do is to kind of show that video first, and then we'll talk about it. Um, and then we'll open up the phone lines and invite any parents who may have had experience with their own kids feeling some of these things and having some of those feelings combined with ideas and influences that they may have encountered on the internet or in peer groups, and how those, from a parent's perspective, changed and affected their kids. So let's go ahead and see if we can get this working. All right, I hope this audio is showing through. We'll let it play.
Why are so many girls deciding they'd rather be boys? Could it be society's toxic expectations of women and girls? Could it be internalized homophobia? How many of them were bullied at school? Could it be they feel safer in the world being perceived as male? How many of them were victims of sexual assault? Maybe they've heard so many conflicting messages about how women are supposed to be that they'd rather opt out entirely. Maybe they feel that they're not like other girls, or that being cishet is boring and uncool. Could it be a desire to belong to a community, or grooming by glitter families? Could it be the regressive stereotypes they are being taught at school? Could it be autism, OCD, BPD, abandonment issues, attachment disorder, eating disorder, body dysmorphia, or normal teen angst exploited by adult groomers. How many of them have eating disorders and body image problems? Maybe they think testosterone will give them control over their bodies. Maybe because young people are now told, in addition to choosing a career path, they must also figure out their gender identity. Could it have anything to do with social media influencers presenting transition as a cure for all kinds of unhappiness? Could it be that mommy or daddy wants attention too? Or because greedy doctors and pharmaceutical companies see a lifelong income stream from children who go down this path? Look at all the detransitioners. There are more every day on YouTube and Detrans Reddit. Listen to them. This presentation was created by somebody who's been there. If you'd like to know more, check out these resources online.
All right. So it's a compelling case. Now, I realize that there are people entering this discussion at different levels of familiarity with some of the terms that get tossed around. And I think one thing to understand in particular, when you start to learn about the issue of trans medical care, trans right activism, and how society is adapting to this, um, newly resurgent kind of concept, is that there are different groups of individuals that enter into this space from different points in life. And what I mean by that is that if you go back maybe 20 or 30 years, the mental health professionals who were seeing people affected by this type of thing were generally seeing middle-aged men. And so when you go back and look at the research, a lot of it is middle-aged men who've already lived, married, had children, and are deciding that they are choosing to live their life as the opposite gender and presenting that way in society. And so a lot of the early research is around that. There was another cohort that was less frequent, which were very young children. And people use the term children when they're talking about these things. And for some of us, when we think of children, we think, okay, well, 18 years and younger is a child. So that's the children. But those ages become very important. And so usually when we're talking about children proper, we're talking about kids before adolescence, before the start of puberty. And then we'll separate adolescents as people at the start of puberty and beyond. And then young adults is generally going to be when you're technically an adult, you're 18, but you're really not to that age where your brain has achieved its mature state, kind of between 18 and 25, 26 sort of thing. That's where an individual is still maturing, still integrating their identity. And it's important to keep those different age groups in mind, because then someone will say, well, what about the children? Why aren't we allowing, or we should allow this for the children? You have to realize there's different groups here. So when we talk about very young children having gender dysphoria, that will be, traditionally it's been young boys who, for whatever reason, decide and consistently decide that they would rather, do the things that they see are associated with girls. And so that form of gender nonconformity is what you'll find in some of the literature that they started to apply certain types of therapy to. And for the longest time, that type of therapy was watchful waiting. And so a young child would have gender nonconforming behavior. They would support the child, talk to the family, and for the most part, it was not involving social transition. It was just a watch and wait and see, continue to reinforce a lot of the norms that you have, and don't do what we're seeing now, which is that social transition intervention. But then over the years, times changed, and the the group of patients that we're seeing now make the overwhelming majority is not these middle-aged men, it's not the young children, it is the center section, which is the adolescent, predominantly girls, adolescent girls and young adult girls, um, deciding to be boys in that way. Now, there's problematic things with all of this language, because you'll find people who say, hold on a second, nobody decides any of this. What they are doing is they are experiencing it, and then they are finding the bravery and the freedom to allow that experience to finally become manifest in their identity. And all of this depends on what the premises you are bringing into this particular thing. And you can see a discussion that I had with Bill Rill on his channel that I'll repost on my channel soon, just to dig back a little bit into those premises. But the key thing here, I think, is just seeing that there are a bunch of reasons that a girl or a young woman might have a very troubled relationship with growing into and inhabiting womanhood, both in their person and body, as well as what womanhood represents in society and how society treats women. And so let's go ahead and take some of that kind of bit by bit. But this is just going to, the real purpose of this show today is really to hear from some parents. So when you hear the term rapid onset gender dysphoria, that's a particular subset where a parent of usually a teenage daughter will have the experience of raising their daughter from infanthood. And generally, the daughter has always seemed to be very comfortable with who they were as girls, and there was no sign or inkling that there was any dysmorphia. There was no, discomfort with being a girl. And then they get exposed to either a peer group at school or in some other environment, or an internet access and social media. And then suddenly their personality starts to change, their ideas start to change, their identity starts to change, and they seem, from the perspective of the parent, to become a different person, in that they are no longer happy with the identity that they previously inhabited, that was a natural evolution of themselves in the context of their family. And so the parents are trying to figure out, is this normal teenage angst? Because there is a normal experience of differentiation that adolescents go through, where they are starting to come into their own and explore ideas that are different and separate from what their parents represented. And there's a normal process of integration that ultimately happens once they go on that identity exploration. And if you talk to people from previous generations, much of that identity exploration dealt with peer groups at school, with interfacing with different kind of, ways of being a teenager. Whether you were I'm in Texas, so whether you were the roper or the heavy metal kid or the goth kid or the emo, these were all different kind of forms of identity that were a way of separating yourself from your parents and from other groups, and finding a community and exploring different ways of being. But they all dealt with just changing superficial aspects of yourself, maybe listening to different music or being interested in different things. And as a teenager evolved over time, they were able to maybe move from group to group and experiment with different ways of conceptualizing their identity and forming themselves separate from their parents. But as they did that, they were never making any changes that were irreversible. They were always able to experiment with these things, pick them up, try them on, and then put them down. And then later, as they began to integrate their full mature adult selves, they would keep parts of all of those different things. And then they would perhaps revisit aspects of their upbringing and their parent, and allow that also to be part of the influence that they had. And their integrated adult self would be unique and part of that journey. The challenge with this issue of transgender is that it's no longer something that you can put on and try out without irreversible changes. And these aren't just simple irreversible changes. Like, you could say, well, a tattoo is irreversible, but a tattoo does not prevent you from starting a family yourself, or it does not give you major medical complications for the rest of your life that make you dependent on the medical institution. So it's a different type of identity exploration, and it's married to some very strict ideological things, such as, if your parents don't accept and celebrate some of these decisions, well, then they are in the category of bad people. And there's whole hosts of other people who are willing to be the type of parent that you should have. And it's a way of drawing a wedge between the kids and the parents. And so when you speak to a lot of these parents who are dealing with this particular category of the rapid onset gender dysphoria young adult or teenager, many of them are very afraid of being able to actually speak their mind and their concerns about how some of these outside influences may be affecting their kids, because the influence is married to this idea that anyone who pushes back against these choices and these decisions that you're making is a bad person and should be cut out of your life. And so the parents are afraid of being cut out of their life. Now, if you paid attention to this channel in the past, this we started out with a discussion of some red flags of things like cults or high demand groups. And one of those things that is a red flag is drawing a wedge between the individual and their family or anyone else who would not accept the beliefs of the group. And so anytime you see a group that's trying to isolate somebody from a family of origin on the question of whether or not they accept these beliefs, that's kind of a red flag that there may be some form of undue influence going on. And so that's a big part of all of this. So with that said, now rapid onset gender dysphoria is this experience where generally teenagers, adolescents, and young adults um, have dramatic shifts in their personality and their conceptualization of themselves and gender and society, and start to see this gender dysphoria as a major component of their experience. And there's a whole set um, of ideas and a whole direction that they would then go in terms of social transition and medical transition. And it's become part of this whole culture battle, while the parents are seeing these changes, knowing the history of the kid, knowing that this was not part of their early history, and seeing that perhaps something is going on that's more ideological than actually physical and biological. So I want to post the phone number. If you are a parent who has had this experience in your life, then certainly I'd like to hear from you. You can call and it will be anonymous. Hopefully, I've had some audio issues earlier, but hopefully those are resolved. And then we can go. But in the meantime, while we're waiting for a call, let me see if I can bring this up again, and we will. Okay, here, we'll bring this up here. We'll go back to the actual original thread from Corlson and just look at those things one at a time. And so here is the original thread. The question at first, why are so many deciding? And the second one. So this one, could it be society's toxic expectation of women and girls? Now, I'm not a woman. I didn't have to go through the process of being a girl who could interact with boys and not have a bunch of expectations. Suddenly, puberty hits, my body's changing, and then the way that I'm now interfacing with people that previously seemed to be rather normal um, is loaded with sexualization. And so that's not something I had to experience, but I am a father of daughters. And I've seen how that experience can affect young women. On top of that, if you listen to the stories of detransitioners, many of them will describe how they had a friend group when they were young, and suddenly puberty hits themselves as well as boys that they previously had as part of their friend group. And so not only is their body changing and they're having to come to terms with that, but the changes, the hormonal changes happening in the boys in their peer group cause the boys to interface with them differently. And suddenly this whole world of sexualization and themselves being kind of an object and treated for something other than just who they are, but rather the body that they inhabit, becomes a source of stress, anxiety. It seems to be, it's almost like something that is they're powerless against, because all of these biologic forces are there. And so it becomes a very disconcerting, discomforting sort of experience that is a contributor to the dysphoria. It's a contributor to the feelings that they have that are so upsetting. But the thing is, this is a universal female experience. It's something that women have gone through ages, and the the thing that can help in many instances, if you have a parent that understands this process and that you have lines of communication that are open, and the parent is still regarded as a trusted source of how to deal with life, then the parent is able to say and communicate to the young woman who's going through this issue of puberty that, these things are part of growing up and that there are ways to understand and adapt to these things. And so, if that's the voice that is influencing a young individual faced with this challenge, then they may go in one direction. But if that signal in their life has been reduced or minimized, and the signals from social media, from other peer groups, is maximized, then they're going to get a different message about how this is a manifestation of all that's wrong in society, and that they need to see it in a different way, and that changes that they could make themselves could fix some of the discomfort that they feel about this. And so the narrative and the direction that an individual experiencing this for the first time is exposed to will have an effect on how they see themselves and the choices and direction that they put themselves in. And there are a bunch of different voices out there informing people about what this experience means and what they can do about it. So, if you have anything to share on this point, then I invite you to call 210-422-2222, and we'd love to hear from you. Did your kiddo have some of these experiences, and was it part of their own journey? We'd love to hear from you. Okay, so let's see here. I want to close that setting and see if I can get this back up. Okay, let's go to the next one. Okay, could it be internalized homophobia? Now, this is one that the people who did this research for young kids who experience gender dysphoria and follow them over time, as well as some of the teenagers, once if this dysphoria and gender nonconformity extended into the teenage years, because the majority of the ones that are as children experiencing this, the process of puberty eventually resolves it, and they integrate and come to terms with their biology. But it turns out that a significant percentage of the people who experience that end up being gay. And so that gender nonconformity is just part of the variety of expressions that ultimately end up in somebody becoming or coming to terms with themselves as a homosexual. And so a lot of the experience that you'll hear from detransitioners is that wrestle over accepting themselves as gay, and you're going to see a bunch of different ways that this manifests, and you can have kind of structural ways that this manifests. If you look at some Middle East countries, there are high numbers of transgender individuals, but that's because transgenderism, or just changing yourself to represent the other gender, is a way to live a homosexual lifestyle without falling into the strict cultural prohibition, cultural or religious prohibition against homosexuality. And so you'll find that surgeries and interventions in that direction exist in a significant proportion in those areas, but it's a way to avoid the conflict of homosexuality. Beyond that, when you listen to detransitioners in perhaps environments where they grew up in really strict religious households, where even in Western countries there was a strong religious prohibition against homosexuality, then this is a way to perhaps soften that or walk around that. And there are instances even in England. There's a particular TED talk by a parent who is explaining that the father was not very happy with having a gay child, and but when they started to do the transition, then it was no longer seen as gay; it was just seen as reconciling that issue, and so that was an influence in the decisions to take interventions in that, and so that was a way that this type of impulse manifests. But many times it's just the individual themselves starting to come to terms with the fact that they aren't like other boys or girls, but not yet realizing or integrating that they're gay. But suddenly all these other ideas about what it means that you don't seem to fit into the boxes that are the norms. And so they explore those things, and they end up through social pressure, through misunderstanding, through just the process of exploring different identities, going into one of these areas. And then suddenly all of this praise and celebration that happens at the front end, combined with some of the ridicule and demonization that you could have, that you could experience if you decide to change direction, just all plays a role in driving somebody to make more and more decisions and steps along that pathway. Okay, so let's see. That's one of those things here. I do want to invite anyone who as a parent has experienced these types of changes in their kids to call in because we'd love to hear from you. Many of the parents have a hard time, as I said before, talking publicly about this because they fear the negative reaction of their kids and they fear being cut out of the life of their kids. And it's kind of like a double edged sword because not only are they then felt like they can't connect with their kids, but it reduces the signal of their influence in the life of their kid. It reduces their ability to impart their wisdom, their experience into the life of their kids. And so it becomes a really challenging thing. I've showed before on this channel clips of the parents of the garbage eaters, which is a fundamentalist Christian cult that preys upon young college students, finding them when they're trying to, make their own way in the world, find a new community. They'll invite them to some form of Bible study, but then that starts the process that eventually leads them to identifying with this new group, taking on a new name by the group, and then cutting their family out of their lives and going into the country to live the fundamentalist lifestyle of the group leader. And if the parents show up or try to find them, then they block them and move to a different location. So there's a network of parents who feel lost, who are just trying to find their children in the first place. And when you start to listen to some of the parents of these kids, you see a lot of similarities in how the parents feel disconnected and cut out of the lives of their kiddos. And it's always a struggle to find those glimmers of reconnection that might be a pathway outside of some of the more strong ideological groups that intersect with this issue. All right, so let's keep going here. Again, the number is 210-422-2222 if you'd like to call and share some of your perspective. We would love to hear from you. All right, so what is the next one? Next one. Could it be that they feel safer in the world being perceived as male? How many of them were victims of sexual assault? And this is the one that very uncomfortably comes up again and again, where many of the young women who ultimately detransition and then are able to talk to people about their experience will explain that they themselves were the victims of either abuse or assault or other ways of having really negative experiences regarding being a woman, being a girl, and being targeted by predatory men. And stepping away from existing as a feminine female girl in the world is like a shield of protection. If they can be perceived of as masculine or as men, then it seems like a shield against that type of abuse. It's protective and it's kind of a defense mechanism. And so that aspect of the way that you'll hear different transitioners speak about this is something that's important. And when you listen to mental health professionals who would otherwise like to explore this dimension of the landscape of an individual's psychology when they present with gender dysphoria, many of them feel that it's difficult to go down that pathway because there is this idea that if a child or an adolescent presents with gender dysphoria, you should affirm immediately. And then you should start them on the pathway of social transition and then medical hormonal transition. And that if you start to say, well, I understand that's part of your experience, but let's look at other aspects of your experience. And that type of exploration of the entire landscape of the individual that may uncover and then deal with the trauma of abuse or assault, that never happens because that's now considered conversion therapy. Because if you're looking for a reason why somebody experiences dysphoria and then identifies as trans, well, then you're trying to detrans them. You're trying to do conversion therapy in the same paradigm as gay conversion therapy was. But those two things are very different. They are not related to each other. And finding a better understanding of an individual's complex psychology, which may contribute to why they are interfacing with gender in this different way, is an important dimension of holistic treatment of somebody. And there's a distinction between that and affirmative care. When you hear about the affirmative care model, it's generally focused primarily and solely on the affirmation process, and exploring some of these other things becomes somewhat taboo. If you do explore them, then it's never with the idea that the decision for transition is somehow dependent on it. Okay, it looks like we've got a call. Let's see. Hopefully, this will work. Hello, you're on Talk on Things and Stuff. Can you hear me?
Can you hear me?
I can, and hopefully the audience will be able to chime in if they can hear you as well. I had some audio issues, and so I'm hoping that it's resolved. What's on your mind?
Well, so I actually had two ROGD kids, 2 out of 3 transitioned, or they decided they were trans during the pandemic. And my son has actually decided that it was just body dysmorphia now. It took a really long time to get there, and I'm still working with my daughter.
How old were they when this happened?
So my daughter was 16, and my son was 18.
And what was your first introduction to these ideas? Was this something that you knew about beforehand, or was it something that, as a parent, kind of hit you out of the blue? What was your first introduction to it?
Yeah, so I had no idea what was going on. I'd had a coworker who transitioned at one point, and so I, had some idea that there was this transition existed. And in that case, I was very supported, and I apologize. I'm getting a lot of echo back.
Okay, sorry about that. I'm trying to balance the audience being able to hear you. Okay. Give it another shot.
So, uh, so really, it started with my daughter being. I mean, so really, it started with a complete separation from friend groups. My daughter was supposed to have this big Sweet 16 party, and at that point, she was the one kid that I knew that I was never going to have to worry about. And my wife got an exposure to COVID at work, and we decided that we were going to be good citizens and just shut down. When we did that, she spent more and more time on the internet, and especially with some of these chat programs like, or I guess the DeviantArt was really the big one that they were both spending an infinite amount of time on, and I hadn't realized that there was this weird subculture of transitioning. And even at the time, I probably wouldn't have worried, because at the time, I had thought this was really more of a legitimate psychological thing versus this kind of weird culty monster that it's turned into.
Yeah.
Started to get very flex, right?
Yeah. Okay. So I'm going to restate some of what you said, because I'm having some audio issues, unfortunately. But it sounds like you in the context of COVID, had a period of time where people came home and were online terminally, and one of the doorways to different ways of thinking was the deviant art website, which I've heard before from other detransitioners is a doorway to that. Tumblr is another one. And that you started to see it affect your daughter in the way that she identified and conceptualized herself, as her and her peer group started trying on different identities. Asexuality was one of them, and that you started, in the context of a breakup, for her to identify initially as asexual, but then started to see her binding her breasts, and then starting to see her redefining some gayness, for example. So if she starts to identify as masculine or something other than female, then it now redefines what her boyfriend is. He's no longer heterosexual, he's now gay. Does that summarize a lot of that?
Yeah, it really does.
How does that experience, like, as a parent, sometimes when we listen to kids who have gone through this journey, they'll say, well, actually, I've not been comfortable with my gender my entire life. Even when I was a toddler, when I was growing up, I always wasn't comfortable with wearing a dress or being my gender. And as a parent, you're left flabbergasted. You're like, what are you talking about? Like, I have video of you prancing around like a princess. Like, I didn't dress you that way. You went and did that and then said, hey, take this video of me. And so there's like a disconnect, so that when they start to encounter these other ideas, they're rewriting their own history so that it conforms to the ideology. Did you experience anything like that?
My advice is that if you ever get a coming out speech like that, then you should just Google it word for word and see what website your kid's getting it from, because it's almost assuredly a script.
Yeah. But that's because these websites are telling the kids, hey, this is how you come out, this is what you need to say, and that they'll have scripts for what you say to your parents, but they'll also have scripts for what you say to your mental health and medical professionals to make sure that you get hormones, or to make sure that you get the interventions that you need. Um, and so that, I think that dimension of it really makes it feel like it's this manipulative cult-like sort of thing, because you have to instruct the people not to really be authentic with who they actually are, but to redefine history and to say things that aren't actually true.
One of the things that I actually kind of am still trying to figure out is if this is an accidental cult or if it's an intentional cult. Because the love bombing and the redefining thinking, the thought stopping techniques, the
Kind of us versus them and black white thinking.
there's so many different aspects of this that line up with the description of cult activities in combating cult mind control.
Yeah,
it's a great book.
you're talking about the book by Stephen Hassan that outlines and defines a lot of these cult concepts.
Right. So what I don't know is whether or not there's just been a perfect storm of teenagers acting strange on the internet, or if there's actually something behind it.
Yeah, I've struggled with that as well. I started looking at high demand religions and saw how those types of things were generally centered around like a charismatic individual, the prophet who started the group, and then he would kind of direct things. And you have to say there's something different about what's happening here. But when you start to look at political movements that take on a cult-like dimension, many times it's the ideology itself that is the driver. And it's the identity that comes along with the ideology that becomes the, kind of like the cult leader. And a lot of those things trigger the same social dynamics, whether it's love bombing or demand for conformity or perpetual inadequacy. They manifest just in the way that social people work together, where there's a matrix of what is good and who is bad, and how that interfaces. It's just some aspect of our humanity that leads it in that pathway. So I've started to describe the cult centered around a charismatic individual as a cult of personality. Whereas a cult that is centered around a set of ideas and beliefs that pervade through, a group of people as more of a cult of ideology. And so that's kind of where I've seen both of these things have high demand on the individuals that inhabit them. They are just shaped in different ways. They occupy different spaces. Whereas a cult of personality, generally people are coming together in some physical location, whereas a cult of ideology can be diffused everywhere. And the location that they come to is social media. And that nexus of social media is a part that hasn't really been studied as intensely, even in the context of ROGD, where they didn't really say, hey, how much exposure to the internet did your kid have? Did any of these ideas precede exposure to the internet? And in COVID, it was perhaps a little bit easier to pin things down on the internet, but this existed pre-COVID. And even if you put all the blocks and everything on your internet, they're still going to school and interacting with peer groups, and the other peers in that group don't have the internet restricted and blocked it. And so these ideas can transmit, that way as well. What do you think was the majority influence in your own kiddos experience?
That's a good question. So I think it was mostly peer pressure, that it was definitely a huge group think situation. As far as the charismatic individuals, I mean, there's no shortage of charismatic individuals that are pushing these kids towards this, or have their own TV show that they want to emulate, um, or whatever. I mean, there's you don't there there are just so many of the people on TV and on the internet telling you live your authentic self. But if your authentic self is that you're a teenage girl or a teenage boy, then you're invited to sort of rethink your authentic self by your group around you.
Yeah.
So I don't think you actually need to have that one charismatic person at the center of the cult. There's so many charismatic people on the internet and on TV that can be that driver. And then you just say, oh, well, if you want to be like this person, then you just have to do these, X, Y, and X, Y, and you'll be fine.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. That's and you ask yourself, like, why is this suddenly showing up in TV? It seems like every new show, every new movie has a character that now becomes a role model or an example of this, pushing further youth in that direction. But then you listen to things like disclosures out of Disney's content creators, where there's a strong desire to insert some of these ideas into the show specifically to influence young people. And it's coming from, I don't think it's nefarious. I think it's just that those people have a very strong idea that there exists people who should have the freedom to live their life in this way, but that they're in a prison of the culture as it exists now. And so it's their responsibility as content creators in a world that culture is expressed through medium of movies and shows. It's their responsibility to insert these ideas so that young people exposed to this medium of culture can start to expand the conception of themselves. Um, but if that idea that they're trying to insert is motivated by some of these ideological forces that are disconnected from reality, then you're inserting ideas that can ultimately lead people down pathways that are not in their best interest. And I think that's kind of what we're wrestling with. And this is not to say that adults can't make decisions.
Baby Gonzo from the Muppet
Oh, yeah.
Babies.
Yeah. And it's so interesting because Gonzo represented for so long in the Muppets somebody who was different, who was unique. And the idea was that there was something special about the fact that he wasn't like anything else. And it kind of opened up and allowed individuals to be like, yeah, I can be different too, and I can still find a place. And it's kind of a very opening, horizon broadening sort of thing. But when you marry it to this one particular ideology, in that, Gonzo is really, even though everyone's been using certain pronouns, they want these other pronouns. It actually confines you and puts you in a very narrow zone of what you can be. And that's just the paradox of all of this, is even though it's supposedly broadening the world, it puts people in very narrow conceptions of what it means to be a man or woman from that ideological perspective. Okay, well, I appreciate you sharing some of your thoughts. This is kind of my first experiment in trying to reach out specifically to parents to get some of their experience, and I want to be able to hear from some other parents, but I will solve some of these technical issues and we'll have some more conversations in the future and would love to hear more from you.
Thank you for hosting.
All right, take care. All right, hello, you are on Talk on Things and Stuff.
Hey, my name is Shannon.
Hey, Shannon, what's on your mind?
Yeah, so I'm this right now with, well, my oldest kid went through this a couple years ago. She came out and then said that she thought she was trans and then is now bisexual. And I'm dealing with it also with my youngest child, who is currently either trans or non-binary. So my experience has been just finding the right therapist is super, super important, and allowing them to go through that experience of figuring it out and not judging them while they're going through that experience. Because I feel like if you push any kind of orthodoxy one way or the other, it can backfire, you know? And so as a parent, I just sit by and observe and have conversations with the therapist, with the doctors, with my kids, and just kind of allow them to process things kind of slowly.
You bring up a good point about choosing the right therapist. And I've listened to a lot of parents talk about the struggle here because the world of therapy itself has been heavily influenced by these ideas, such that some therapists have adopted an affirmation only approach. And so some parents are concerned of, well, if I bring this to that type of therapist, and some are speaking from experience, then the therapist is actually going to cement and make very concrete from an authoritative perspective that this is what the child is. And the parents feel even more disempowered after having brought their child to that type of therapist. And you'll hear some detransitioners say, this is what happened to me. And I'm really upset at my therapist for not asking the questions about everything else that was going on in my life and trying to figure out my whole complex scenario. How do you find and identify a type of therapist who is willing to both listen to and not, be so strong and rigid in one way, but is more exploratory in how they approach this issue? Yeah, hold on. I gotta quit out of that. Sorry. My brother's trying to reach out to me.
Okay. So yeah, that's
Mhm.
from Mormonism, and so this idea of black and white dogmatism is the one way at this point.
Yeah.
And so I do kind of look at things with a bit more nuance than I did before. And so what I like to do is I like to just sit and listen and find out before I make any judgment what exactly is going on. Like what's behind it. I'm not jump to conclusions. I'm not insert my belief on it or on the therapist. But yeah, just having conversations with therapists and listening to them, and I kind of get a feel for how dogmatic they are.
Oh, I see. Okay. Have you found that the therapist has been open with you? Sometimes when a parent will bring a kiddo to a therapist, suddenly there's this secret world of the therapist and the kiddo. And then when the parent tries to follow up with the therapist and say, can you let me know what's going on or how this is going, then the therapist kind of there's almost like a wall between the secret world of the therapist and the kiddo and the parents. And some of that is if a therapist is in heavily in the ideological space of this movement, then they also have internalized the idea that parents can be an adversary. Parents can actually be toxic or, a problem for the kiddo. And so they align themselves with the kid rather than with the parent. And did you encounter that, or is that something that was on your radar?
Yeah, no, we definitely did encounter some of that. It really just depends on the therapist and the relationship that you have with your child, I think. It's going back a couple of years when I was, more of an active woman. Yeah, things were kept from me because I could, like, honestly, I probably wasn't taking things very well. And there was probably more of that fear of religious dogma.
Mm.
As I kind of reflected back and had therapy for myself and deconstructed religion and all of the other things, it was easier for my kids to open up to me and tell me what was actually going on. The fear wasn't there, so the wall wasn't there,
Right.
I also hesitate to call this a trend just because I think it diminishes the people who are actually transgender. Like, I know there's a mix of people who are getting swept up and caught up in this, but there's also the people where this is a reality for them. And I have family members with celiac disease who cannot have gluten. And for a long time, we would go to a restaurant and say, hey, do you have anything gluten-free in your menu? And we would get eyes rolled and scoffed because it was a trend. Everyone wanted everything gluten-free. And they wouldn't take it quite as seriously, even though there were serious health effects for my family members.
Mm-hmm. No, I think, that for me, I kind of look at it as we want to have a free society where people have the liberty to choose to live their life as they want. As long as they're not hurting anybody else, then a free society should allow all kinds of people to live and present and speak of themselves however they choose to do. I think the difficulty that you're alluding to is when we're dealing with kids and some of these irreversible changes, then apart from the freedom of society, we have a different principle that we have to balance. And from the side of doing some of these irreversible changes, you have to bring the medical community into it. And the medical community is guided by certain ethical principles that suddenly have to be applied to it. And some of that is the principles of first do no harm. And then you have evidence-based medical principles where if you're going to intervene in somebody who is experiencing something, you have to have a certain level of confidence that the intervention is actually going to address the root cause and it's going to result in a positive outcome. And so you have to define the disease very well. You have to make sure that the tests that you have done establish the efficacy of the treatment that you have. And so that process should be allowed to go through, but you have to do it with a degree of scientific rigor that is proportional to the effects of the therapy. And so when we're talking about types of a therapy that lead to sterilization, lead to lifelong medical complications in significantly high percentages of people, and lead to lifelong dependence on things like hormones, well, then the degree of confidence that you have that the evidence of the interventions that you're doing are going to have a positive outcome has to be very high. And once you confront the reality of detransitioners and you realize that there are people who, for all of our selection criteria at the front end, it is ultimately not the right choice for, well, that means you have to be very, very careful about your selection criteria at the front end, and you need to be very careful about tracking people, because if the detransitioners all decided after 6 months, this wasn't for me, that would be one thing. You could have a 6-month window. But what we're seeing is that these lifelong changes, people don't realize their effects on their lives in some cases till 10 years after an intervention, when in a normal person's life, they get to that point of their life where they start to think about having a family. And some of those decisions that a adolescent child doesn't have the context of life to make an irreversible decision for themselves as a middle-aged person, those are really heavy stakes. And so the medical side of this issue has to be very, very rigorous and scientific and evidence-based. And some of the things that we're seeing is that that is not happening. So even if we want to have a society that is free for people to live as they want, we have to balance that with the interventions that are happening for kiddos in particular.
Absolutely. Yeah, no, I agree with that. Absolutely. So the experience that we had was first, they have to go through the social transition, like the haircut, the clothes, the name, the pronouns, all of that for quite a long time, while meeting with a therapist, while meeting with a doctor, before they will even consider giving them any kind of puberty blockers. And we never got to puberty blockers in our experience, because going through that really long process of socially transitioning and dealing with the doctors and all of the therapy appointments, it kind of helps the kid figure out if this is the right thing for them or not. So I guess all I would say is find the right doctors and take it slow. I know there are some situations where people are more of a rush, and when the kid, you know, is 2 or 3 or 4 and is saying that they are the opposite gender, you know, there's probably something else behind that. There's probably something medical behind that. I don't know. But in other situations, just be there, be supportive, be open, and don't just yell at the kid and tell them they're wrong, I guess.
No, I think that there's a couple of voices in the world of detransition that I think have been particularly helpful. One is Helena. She showed up in a few documentaries and is one of the early interviews on Benjamin Boyce's channel. But one of the things that she'll say is kind of what you're talking about, where if this does happen to one of your kids and you're a parent, try to connect with them, listen to them, but connect them with as a full parent. Like, make sure that you're enjoying and experiencing the full measure of life, of activities and events and connection that doesn't have anything to do with the gender stuff, so that you're able to still show them that you love and accept them as a complete person. Because if everything comes down to a battle on this one particular thing, that it's going to just serve as kind of a reinforcing wedge between you and your child. And it's hard to do. There's a lot of fear and anxiety that a lot of parents have about where this can lead to, and it definitely can cause parents to go on their own spazzy reaction to all of this. So it's a difficult thing. Thank you so much for your call, Shannon. And I'm going to see if we can get another caller in here, and hope to hear from you again in the future.
Okay.
Take care. Bye. Okay, so if you would like to join the conversation, you can call 210-422-2222. Let's see what kind of comments that we have coming up to this point. Water on Mars says, in the 90s, it was goths. Now it's this. The only difference is that a lot of it can't be undone. And thus the commies finally crossed the line, China's ultimate influence on our zeitgeist to stop breeding. It crosses the line into a little bit of conspiracy theory, conspiracy thinking there. There are some people who will point to some parallels between what happened in the Chinese Communist Revolution in the 1960s and what we're experiencing now. And I think that lesson is real, and that there can be very powerful totalistic ideologies that sweep through a culture and try to purge the culture of everything in the past. And I think there's some parallels there, but saying that China specifically inserted these ideas is a bit too far. Hello, you're on Talk on Things and Stuff.
Hey, good morning.
Good morning. Can you hear me?
I can.
All right.
Very
You might
difficult
mute
to
your computer in the background, because I think there's a little bit of an echo there. But
I sure did.
what's on your mind?
So my family and I have been navigating this with my now 16-year-old for about 5 years. And it kind of started out in the beginning as I think I'm a lesbian, to I think I'm non-binary, to please address me as they, them, to I think I'm a man, and now I'm a gay man. and I had a question that I thought maybe I could pick your brain. Is, do you think that there is a correlation between youth transitioning or wanting to transition and potential ACEs scores of like the adverse childhood experiences?
Hmm. The ACEs score is something that, if you're not familiar with it, is kind of a way of rating how traumatic a childhood's upbringing has been. And so there's different events that a child might experience growing up, whether it's abuse, malnutrition, divorce, instability in the home, a number of different things that kind of get tallied up and added up, and then it presents as a degree of trauma that a child may have experienced growing up. And there's hypotheses that kiddos who have certain ACE experiences, or certain scores on that, may have certain types of outcomes. And there's some debate about that, because a lot of people will point to kids who grew up in some of the worst, harshest environments that would go off the charts with ACEs that seem to not to fit some of the hypotheses that exist out there. So I think it's an open-ended question. I definitely think it's worth investigating and having some ideas about. But to pin it down to that, I think is going to be a challenge. But I'm totally open to hearing people's ideas about how that could be. I think particularly when you see the degree of sexual abuse that may be in the history of some people, and you ask yourself the question, if in particular a girl who's been the victim of sexual violence or sexual assault sees being feminine and being a woman or being a girl as a vulnerability, and that now there's this menu of choices that they can choose for themselves, and that their anxiety over potentially having that experience again is given the name of gender dysphoria, then it gives them a way to go into that space and to inhabit those other identities that can be a type of protective mechanism. And you can say, well, that's an example of a significant ACEs experience being an open door to making some of these choices for your identity. And there may be something to that.
Yeah, and I was curious, because I know that substance use can correlate with the ACEs score, and and for example, particularly in my family, as a person in recovery from a diagnosed addiction, is transitioning the safer option for implementing some type of control in what may feel like for that youth a uncontrollable life, or things that they haven't been able to control that are painful to them to think about, like, and knowing my child watching me suffer through my own choices of in my addiction of the substance use that I've used, has this half been the quote unquote safer view to them.
Right.
Her, you know what I mean? So I was just curious if anybody else's experiences have been. And I work for our community mental health provider for the county in my state, and my child goes to therapy through the organization that I work for. And unfortunately, it's an affirming, style counseling service, and I work in the substance use portion of the agency, but it's so hard because, like, my opinion of what's happening is the unpopular opinion, and it's difficult being the parent of a child, not wanting things to be different, but also making a living working for the agency that's not helping.
Yeah. No, I think it's helpful to understand that when you go out and you look for therapists, you can talk to the therapist in your screening of them, and you want to find out if the therapist is an affirmation model therapist. Then understand that there's other modes of therapy for this. And so if you find somebody who's more of a gender of an exploratory therapist that wants to look holistically at the full dimension of a kiddo, and of which gender is one part, then if that as a parent is something that feels to you like a better way to approach this issue, then in your screening of therapists, then you can kind of ask the questions that would go to that. beyond that, if you go to some of the resources that are listed at the end of that video that I showed at the beginning, um, there's some people that have kind of created indexes of therapists who don't follow the affirmation only model, but follow a more holistic, comprehensive model that allows for exploration of some of those other things. And so parents might find that as a good resource to approach this issue with their own kiddos on.
Well, thank you. Is there going to be a link for that in the, because obviously I'm looking at it on my phone, so I.
Oh yeah, I can see if I can put that both in the description as well as a comment here in a little bit.
Wonderful.
I have a question
much.
for you though. When you describe that you've been struggling this for a while, have you found, was it exposure to social media that was,
Yes.
you feel, the introduction of some of these ideas, or was it a peer group? Where do you feel like these ideas came from?
100%. And I understand. I know, like, the moment it happened is I gifted my children for Christmas one year Kindle Fires with access to the internet. And my daughter was 10 at the time, and shortly after, they were little comments. Like, there was she did this little thing where she videotaped me as she told me that she was a lesbian to get my reaction. And I'm just like, what are you doing? She's like, well, Mom, I'm a lesbian. I'm like, no, honey, you're 11. You didn't say that right. You're 11. You know, and I didn't react probably the way that she wanted me to. And from there on, you know, shortly after that, she started middle school in 6th grade, had access to a whole nother population of children. And then immediately after that, the next year, school shut down and we were all online. So I think it was it's a multifaceted just reasons of why. Internet, it's new peers, then it's COVID, followed by all the downtime of just watching the things online and almost like starting to do the things that will create evidence as to why this is true for her. Like,
Right.
People who don't acknowledge the transitioning youth, like not acknowledging, or it's suicide prevention to acknowledge and affirm transition. And then, you know, knowing that me and the remainder of my family are not as supportive, it's like, well, Mom, I tried to kill myself. And it's just like, you know, and as a parent, that's a terrifying thing. It's a terrifying thought when your child describes to you their attempt at ending their life. And, you know, what are your options? Is it tiptoe around this subject and give in on a few little things, but not give in on the big things? Because I mean, like, at this point, they've changed their name. Their driver's permit has their fake name and their fake gender on it, and then, you know, their school diploma is going to have this fake name on it. We've been binding for 3 years, and now we're being pressured for testosterone, and I'm just like, we're clinging to the medical aspect of, you're 16, we don't know what this is going to do, you're still growing, your body's still growing, and now it's, well, I have a peer support person through therapy, and he's been on testosterone for 8 years, and I'm just like, okay, well, how old is he now? Oh, well, he's 30. Okay, so when he was 22, not 16, I'm going to maintain the medical aspect of this in order to fight it off for a little bit longer. But at 16 years old and still hanging on to that testosterone thought, I feel like we're too far from, like.
I was a 30-year-old a
Wait for
peer
this to
support
pass.
person for a 15-year-old or a 16-year-old.
Yep.
At school?
No, this is through the community mental health provider.
Oh. That's a challenge. And that,
Sorry,
I think,
I talk a lot and I hit a lot of topics very quickly.
no, I mean, that's a lot of stuff, but that's kind of the chorus of what you hear when you start to listen to parents on this. And if I put myself in your shoes, I started to think, well, you know, you've got all these other forces that are trying to say what's best for my kid, and my kid is listening to these other voices, but not listening to me. And so it's kind of like you're the most invested in the outcome for this person that you've fostered and loved and brought up your whole life, and these other people are demonizing the parent on this particular point. I don't know. It's just I really starting to feel like the parents are the lost voice in a lot of this discussion. Even the way that different shows and everything tend to focus on the experience of the individual, the parents have a perspective that is not being listened to.
Right. I'm terrified that here we are 16. I have 2 years left before this person can claim that they're an adult and go off and make these life altering decisions for themselves when indeed they're still a child. And I mean, good luck paying a power bill, because just the world is not the same as it was when I, turned 18. And I don't know how you're going to go off and support yourself at 18, but I also made the statement of I will not. If
Yeah.
this is a choice that you're going to make, which is, I always don't want to be that parent that abandons their child at 18 because they're not doing what I want them to do. But at the same time, like, I don't know what the hell to do.
Yeah. Well, I think coming to the terms with some of these decisions about their individual body are their decisions, and they are adult decisions, and they are decisions that they can make for themselves. You as a parent, you can be there to provide additional perspective and perhaps the long view of a parent's wisdom, but they get to make decisions for themselves. But that doesn't mean that you have to finance or support or do those things for them. But there's this thread of, this rumination and focus on gender and dysphoria that is married to this idea that the world is against you. And so not only do you ruminate on gender, but then you ruminate on all the oppression that goes along with it. And you go online to discussion forums or to social media, and you've created an echo chamber, and the algorithms will help you do this. They'll make sure that you just see more and more of what you've been interested in. And so there's this constant rumination on that. And while you're doing all of that, you're not doing the normal milestones of maturity that an adolescent should be doing. And, in the past, when I was growing up, those milestones were things like getting a job, holding the job, learning how to drive, getting a boyfriend or girlfriend, having the first kiss, like all these different things that are part of the transition from childhood to adulthood get put on the back burner or called problematic while they ruminate and focus on gender ideology and the oppression and victimhood that are inherent to that. And so they finally get to what would normally be an adult age, but they haven't done a lot of this growing because all of their emotional and cognitive resources have been put into this one particular issue. And I think that's something that a lot of people struggle with. And when you listen to some detransitioners, they'll say, it feels like my life was on hold while I focused on this one thing. And then I get out and all of my peers have taken all of these steps towards adulthood that I didn't take. And I feel like I'm behind my peers because I got derailed onto this particular thing. And, it would normally be a parent who could say, hey, hold on, let's make sure that we're doing these milestones of adulthood. But when the parents are painted as the enemy, it takes away that important role in parenting. And I think trying to figure out how to reclaim that is important. We've heard some success stories from parents who, looking at this experience for other people, said, well, as soon as these things started popping up, I just cut off social media. Because the ideas need to be fed and constantly fed, because that keeps you detached from the real world and the real considerations of the world. And so cutting off social media, as an ex-Mormon, it was really hard. I think it was only through access to social media that I was able to learn some of the truths about the church itself that allowed me to kind of break out of a very narrow way of thinking regarding that religion. And so you get the sense that free exchange of information is a good thing. And so you have teenage kids and you're like, well, I'm not going to restrict the internet because I'm an advocate of free exchange of information. And what gets lost in that is that you, as an adult who's broken out of a high demand religion, already had somewhat of an integrated identity for yourself. And these kids and these teenagers don't yet have that integrated foundation of an identity that has a proven record of being able to sustain life through the course of a life. And so there still is a role for making sure that the signal of other other aspects of life is reduced, and that your parental wisdom, your parental influence is maintained as the primary influence in your kids. And that does mean restricting internet access. Some of the detransitioners in particular have said, you would never invite some 30-year-old stranger to a sleepover with your kids where they could talk to them all night. But by giving them an internet connection with free, unfettered access, that 30-year-old weirdo with his own ideas that are nowhere, you as a parent have nothing to do with his ideas, are in the discussion forum influencing your kid. And if you take your role as a parent seriously, and you take the idea that the values and the culture and the ideas that you hold as a parent should be conveyed to your child, and that is an important dimension of the parent-child relationship and continuing a family, then you're going to want to be very careful about that type of exposure that in particular young kids have to that. And it's been a great reckoning for those of us as parents who've realized that our own decisions in regard to free access to internet through devices has caused this problem. And you just pile that on top of all of the other issues with social media affecting young children that people like Jonathan Haidt are starting to talk more about. And you can see that's a major change that is important to have. So if you're a parent and you're just hearing this type of discussion now, start being more careful about the type of internet exposure that your kiddos have, the type of devices and the unfettered access to the internet that they have.
Absolutely. I agree.
All right. Well, thank you so much for sharing a little bit of your story.
Appreciate
Yeah,
it.
absolutely. And hopefully we'll hear from you again in the future. Take care.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Bye. Okay. Let's see. While we wait for another caller, let's see what other things that we have. One of the prior callers talked about, you've got to go ahead and do the social transition. That is a way to support people. And I think for a long time, we felt like that was the right move. But there's more to say about that. Hello, you're on Talk on Things and Stuff.
Hey, Jonathan, it's Jared Higdon.
Hey, Jared, how's it going?
Pretty good. Thought it was I haven't been able to listen to the whole thing, so you might have been able to already answer a lot of this. But I was listening to your last caller, and that sounded terrifying. But I do feel fortunate. I've grown up, or I've got sort of the benefit of hindsight on this whole social media issue. So my kid's 5 years old. He's autistic, so that is something kind of worry about, that he's going to be vulnerable to that sort of social contagion. Although I hope it's calmed down a little bit before then. Anyway, one of the things I was going to bring up is that there a lot of times it seems like there's sort of an overcorrection when a parent finds out that their kid is dabbling in this gender stuff. I remember hearing the story of, I think it's Walt Hayer is his name. He transitioned to a woman back in the 60s and then detransitioned in 91. And I remember hearing a story, and he talked about he tried on his mom's dress or something like that, and his dad saw it and just started lighting into him, telling him, no son of mine is going to be gay or whatever. And then his grandma, who he spent a lot of time with, she'd tell him, oh, no, you must be a girl. So she would secretly have him be a girl. So it was kind of an interesting sort of light bulb moment for me, I think, listening to that, because he has two options. He's got a dad who's correct, he's not a woman, but he's also just being cruel, and then he's got his grandma who is saying, yeah, you're a woman. And so, of course, he's going to go with being a woman. And of course, he regretted it later, but where else is the kid going to go? One person's beating him up, the other person's affirming them. So I'm curious about your thoughts on striking a balance between sort of being real with your kid and the whole affirmation thing, because it seems like there needs to be sort of a happy medium. Because my reaction to this stuff usually is if somebody tells me that I'm a woman, like I might be look like I'm in a male's body, but I'm a woman, my reaction would usually be like, actually, that's impossible. And I don't know how to broach it really. If somebody I know comes to me with that, I don't want to be cruel to them, but I also don't want to just go full on affirming.
Right. I don't know. I think it's a challenge because when you have discussions like that, both sides are coming with a preset of ideas about what it means to be a woman or what gender is. And some of those ideas come from foundational premises that lead into those definitions. And so I think taking a mindset of curiosity, but then also introducing different perspectives can be important. And so, if somebody comes to you and says, I am a man in a woman's body or vice versa, then taking the perspective of curiosity could be like, well, what does that mean? Like, how does that experience manifest in your life? And if they use a word like woman or man, you just say, well, people have different definitions for that. What is the definition that is the most compelling to you that you're using to guide your choices in these things? And kind of just from a mode of curiosity and listening, tease some of that out. And if you're a parent and doing some of this with your kid, then that can be a way both to find a deeper connection with your kid, a better understanding of where they are, and it's a way for them to feel listening. The caution of this is that I think the social media circles understand where people can start to get confused or lose their attachment to that way of thinking is when they start to see that it is a way of thinking, that there are other ways of thinking. And so what we're hearing some people have been told is if your parents start to ask you questions about these things or say there's other ways to do it, then that's a problem. Don't engage in those conversations. You don't owe them the emotional labor of explaining yourself. They should go out and do the work themselves. And so there's ways of cutting off any engagement with different ways of thinking about this issue that as a parent you would have to find some way to work around if you wanted to have that type of conversation.
It does feel a little bit difficult because you've compared it to the whole Mormonism, like leaving Mormonism thing, because it feels like a lot of ideologies have sort of this built-in defense mechanism, and it feels like once they've gotten to the point of, Dad, I think I'm a different gender, they've probably also gotten the warning, sort of the don't read anti-Mormon literature warning, because it feels reminiscent anytime I talk to somebody and try to remain level-headed. Feels reminiscent of trying to talk to like mission companions and saying like, well, I'm not sure about this thing or this thing, and they just immediately sort of clam up and be like, that's what we don't talk about that,
Yeah. No, I hear you. And what do we do in the Mormon world when you're faced with that? Well, you say, well, let's take this charged topic that you have such a strong identity connection to that you don't listen to any other perspective, put that on the shelf, and let's watch this cult documentary about the Heaven's Gate people. And let's watch this other cult documentary about Waco. And then you show how different modes of control occur in different contexts that don't trigger that defensive mechanism. And then just kind of pray that internal vocabulary of cult control becomes something they can recognize when they see it themselves. And I've had experiences with people who have been in that very closed mindset that once they understand how those types of coercive things happen, it takes time, but they eventually are able to say, I see some of that happening in these social media spaces. And, it's such a scary prospect for a parent to be faced with a kid who's so defensive and antagonistic to their role as a parent that they feel like they've lost the ability to influence their kiddos. But I think having a parent as a source of a predictable, firm worldview that is not aggressive or angry, but is, just firm and maintaining certain boundaries, it can feel hard to do that sometimes. But if it's done in a way that respects individual autonomy and choices and different points of view, can be something that someone at least has a little bit more of a neutral concept of, I've had some of these discussions with people in my life who, I've seen some of these ideas transform who they are, such that they are now making demands of me of how I conceptualize them. And
Yeah, the Mormonism doesn't quite do that.
no, it doesn't. Mormonism's free to say, I believe what I believe, you believe what you believe. As long as we have a society that's free to believe different things, we're good. Well, this society says you have to believe what I believe. You have to use language that I impose on you. And if you don't, then you're the problem. And, if you hand that type of power to a kiddo who's trying to find their way in the world, and you have the recipe to create somebody who's going to have a hard time existing in a pluralistic society where we want people to have the freedom of diversity of thought. And if that, I think that's going to be a major challenge for the generation growing up with this is learning how to exist in a pluralistic society. But that's because these ideas tend to be totalizing and authoritarian.
Yeah, watch out for anything that says child-led.
Yeah, exactly.
All right, thanks, John. I got to get out of here.
All right, appreciate your call, Jared. Hope to hear from you soon.
No problem,
Take
sir.
care. Okay. Let's see here. Okay, we were talking about social transition, and it's being posited as kind of this neutral act. Susie says social transition is not harmless. It leads to puberty blockers, wrong sex hormones, and surgeries. A child cannot understand the implications, nor is wise enough to backtrack when being encouraged. And I think this is a realization that we're starting to see become more tangible in the mental health community. Specifically, if you read the CAS report, one of the things that report particularly zeroes in on is social transition, saying that it's not a neutral act. And some of the very things that Susie mentions are factors that you have to consider. If somebody as a kiddo changes their name, their pronouns, their clothing, their presentation to the wider world, and then does what the rest of that social transition involves, which means correcting people who do it wrong, who don't conform to it, using some of the narrative around victimhood to compel other people to go along with this social transition, all of that creates a very strong head of pressure that eliminates the ease with which a normal adolescent who wants to explore different identities and then change to different identities, that's a normal process of growing up. Well, when you add all of this social baggage onto it, it makes it harder to do that because then there's an embarrassment, there's a shame involved with, having been so militant to the family and the world around you to say, well, actually, that's not true. I don't no longer identify as that. That's a harder step to take. And that's why when you listen to some detransitioners, they'll say, like, I kind of had to step away from my entire social group if I wanted to change anything, because it was just so hard to have been a certain way and then change my mind on it, when for most of that time I was trying to say, no, this isn't a choice. This is just who I am. Well, in the past, mental health professionals have said that's a form of foreclosure of identity, where you're cementing in an identity at an early phase of development where you're not supposed to be cementing in identities. You're supposed to be having the freedom to explore different identities. So knowing that that process is happening, and that it then sets up what has been called the trans train, which is that you do one step, then you do the next step, then you do the next step, and there's this pressure to take the next step to prove the authenticity of your new identity. And it kind of compels people to take more and more steps and makes it harder for that reflection, that reconsideration to take place. Then you have social transition, then you have puberty blockers, then you have cross-sex, or what, as Susie mentioned, wrong sex hormones. And each of these leads into the next thing. And the medical community is having to wrestle with, how to conceptualize that. So you'll hear people triumphantly in gender clinics say that 99% of the people that we put on cross-sex hormones will then go on, or that we put on puberty blockers will then go on to cross-sex hormones and surgery. And they say it like it's a victory, like it's they've achieved something, when what you need to do is compare that to the control group, compare that to the group that does not get those things. And if a significant number of the control group reconciles with their gender dysphoria and takes no further steps on that, then what you've done by introducing the puberty blockers is you've initiated what's called a therapeutic cascade. And that is that you've given one form of therapy that increases the likelihood that another form of therapy will be required as a further step. And if the research is not being done with the control group, where you realize that the therapy itself may be predisposing to future therapies, and so you're compounding then all of the consequences, the negative consequences, the side effects, and the bad outcomes at each step, because you haven't compared it with a control that does not involve the intervention, then you've actually created more complications, more bad outcomes than you would have otherwise by initiating a therapeutic cascade. And it's that concept of, it's a bunch of fancy words, an iatrogenic therapeutic cascade that is gotten lost in the past with this, that people are coming to terms with and trying to say, hold on a second, we need to be careful about the interventions that lead to future interventions. And while puberty blockers is one that people have said, okay, this clearly we're seeing now is initiating a therapeutic cascade, so we need to put the brakes on doing puberty blockers. And that's why you're seeing, in the wake of things like the WPATH files and the CAS report and the results of other systematic reviews, causing nations in Europe to stop initiating puberty blockers. And you can just Google that on right now and see that this is making its waves through many different countries. Then you also have to wrestle with the fact that initiating social transition is a form of psychological intervention. It is a mental health intervention, no different from other interventions that would happen on issues of anxiety, depression, or any other mental health thing where a lifestyle or social change is part of what happens there. And if that social intervention, if that psychological intervention predisposes someone to get on the trans train for later hormonal and surgical interventions, then it has the same ethical considerations and problems that you have to confront as those more medical interventions. And so we're still in the process of learning the degree to which we should be comfortable with social transition, and having good research that looks at control groups and that takes a broad view of these things has really been lacking in the past. So we're hoping to see more of it in the future. Okay. So if you'd like to share a little bit of your perspective on this, you can call 210-422-2222 and hopefully get this. I was able to fix some of the audio a little bit mid-call on one of those calls. I realized there was a wrong setting, so hopefully we'll not have that problem in the future. Okay. Let's see, Susie gives us another comment. It isn't kind to tell children that their body is wrong and that they need to take drugs and surgery to fix it. Tell them the truth. That is kind. This points out one of the paradoxes, I think, that we've seen. If you go from kind of the world I grew up in the 80s and the 90s, the messaging was to people who were experiencing, the world differently. What usually at that time it was coming to terms with a gay experience in the world, was like, listen, it's okay to accept you for who you are. You don't have to change yourself. And now we're seeing kind of the inversion of that, which is that, who you are in your body is wrong. And we need to now enact medical and surgical interventions in your body in order to reconcile that. And it's kind of just it's an inversion of the message, and people are wrestling with what exactly that means, how to deal with that inversion. It kind of goes to, what do you think your authentic self is? If you believe that your body is your authentic self, and you haven't internalized the idea that having an affinity for stereotypes that have traditionally been associated with a particular sex or gender defines you as that gender or sex, if you haven't internalized that message, then seeing some discomfort that you have with traditional stereotypes and an affinity for non-traditional stereotypes or gender non-conforming stereotypes gives you the ability to expand how you conceptualize those genders, so that you can be an effeminate man who is either gay or not gay. Like it broadens the world of what you can be. But if you internalize this notion that your affinity for those stereotypes redefines who you are as a man, and that you have then an authentic self that is in conflict with your gendered body, then it creates a need for these surgical interventions. And it's just, how you conceptualize those ideas that then has ripples into what you do about it. And so those are some of those foundational ideas that affect how you conceptualize this entire issue, that are important to reflect on and to understand as we go forward. And we're seeing it affect the medical industry, where when you look at those people who would say that, exploring, the issues like autism or past abuse or depression, anxiety, eating disorders, exploring those things as a way to understand somebody's gender identity is wrong, because you're doing that in order to reconcile those things to see if they will resolve their dysphoria. And that's conversion therapy. Well, they're starting from the premise that the gender dysphoria is a sign of a true trans identity that is rooted in all of those ideas that you're defining yourself by your affinity for these different stereotypes. And so it assumes before the fact what the right paradigm of therapy is. And that's what makes having those discussions about what types of therapy to do so difficult, because you really have to go back and explore what those assumptions are. But a lot of the medical institutions that have put these protocols out just start from that assumption. And then you have to start having a philosophical discussion with the medical establishment. And the idea is that no, our assumptions are the real world, and your assumptions are actually outmoded, outdated ways of thinking. And so it's a different type of battle. Okay. We have a comment. I detransitioned 4.5 years ago, and I haven't told most of my friends. It's easier to find new ones, but I spend my time alone now. These kids aren't anticipating what it will do to your social lives. And I've lost friends over it. That's a really difficult thing, particularly for young people who are trying to make their way in the world. And if you can remember back to when you were young, having a community was such an important part of your process of development. And in the past, there have been cultural institutions that have been established forms of that type of community that give you a broader identity beyond yourself and something to work for and something to be a part of. A lot of those have been religious institutions. And now that we're seeing these generations grow up having severed those ties to those cultural institutions that, beyond whatever their religious claims were, gave them an established framework and community, well, then they're left open to find other communities. And there are certainly ideological movements that are ready to try to be that community, but they're married to a pathway towards some forms of extremism, potentially. And so that, I think, is some of the treacherous territory that as parents we're trying to understand and navigate for the next generation. Okay. All right. Well, let's see here. Ginger Blaze is making a point here. The physiological and cognitive hormonal developmental changes which occur during natural puberty are curative for children experiencing gender dysphoria. Blocking it blocks the cure. I think this is one of the key things that has gotten lost as the medical institutions have gone down the affirmative only pathway, and that they've lost sight of the fact that if you do that supportive, watchful waiting with supportive care, looking at the full landscape of an individual's psychology, then you're losing the benefit of some of the natural integration of identity and experience that go along with puberty that allow an individual to come to terms with those challenges and resolve that dysphoria and integrate themselves. And when you listen to people like Stephen Levine, who's previously was a part of WPATH and even headed up the committee that made one of their past standards of care, and later resigned from that institution and started talking about how it has been captured by ideologues who want this only affirmative care model. His big thing has been, we have to treat these people as comprehensive whole individuals who have a complex tapestry of things going on in their lives, of which gender is part of it, and understand that by addressing and resolving some of the other things going on in their lives, that may give them a different perspective on this question of gender dysphoria that may allow them to integrate themselves in a way that is not so skewed by these social media distortions. Okay, Caitlin Marler says, why do you only focus on and talk about gender dysphoria and detransitioning? Exactly. So I think that those two concepts, gender dysphoria and detransitioning, are part of the dialogue that gets obscured or lost in the way that discourse is happening around this issue. The issue of gender dysphoria is that a lot of people enter into these debates, whether it's congressional hearings or online discussions like this, and they start talking about trans kids. Trans kids need affirmative care, trans kids need hormone puberty blockers and everything. But by saying trans kid, you're making a diagnosis, and there's a lot loaded into that diagnosis, because you're saying that there's some sort of innate uh, dimension to these kids that is their true identity, that they are trans. So you're taking an ideology and you're cementing it in the diagnosis and identity of these kids, calling them trans, because that then, if you accept all of the assertions of the ideology, it does impose that you need to hormonally and surgically intervene in that. But if you understand that the individuals that you're calling trans kids are kids experiencing gender dysphoria. Now, that's a different paradigm, because kids experiencing gender dysphoria is nothing new. It's been part of humanity forever. And that is part of the process of growing up, is to coming to terms with some of the experiences that happen regarding gender as you transition from childhood into adulthood, as you interface with society. And from the medical perspective, you have to understand that kids who experience gender dysphoria, you can't assume that they are trans kids. The opposite end of that is, well, why do you focus on detransitioning? Well, the detransitioners are the ones who point to the fact that you can't just take a kid with gender dysphoria and assume that they are ineffably and irreversibly trans. And so if you are taking a diagnosis for which there's no strict criteria that has a reliable outcome of always being that way, but you are intervening in ways that are irreversible, then there's a serious ethical problem there, and you have to confront that. And it's really by shining the light on some of these ethical problems and these conflicts that I think the medical institutions and society at large will better understand what's going on and make sure that we don't go down pathways that end up harming the most vulnerable of us. And when we're talking about hormones and surgery and just some of the life milestone and development that happens, it's an important question for parents in particular, who have the greatest motivation to help usher their kids into adulthood in healthy, stable ways. So that's why this is a focus not only of my channel, I think, but if you listen to a lot of other channels too, that the issue of gender dysphoria and detransitioning are both really important factors that get lost or distorted in the way that the dialogue around this issue happens. Now, the question may be guided towards, well, you were an ex-Mormon channel. Why are you talking about this sort of thing? Well, I have experiences in my own life as a parent that, when I first encountered them, I was like, oh, well, I just need to learn more about, this new way of being. As a Mormon, I was closed off to these things, and I always thought things were, black and white, and I need to understand this better so I can better support people in my life who I love. And so I started doing that. And the more I started looking into the issue, the more I started to see that there was an ideological component that was very different from whether somebody is gay, and that it had many of the same red flags about groupthink and social coercion that I would see in a coercive religious group. It just was happening in an online social media sphere. And then I had the other institute of having been a parent of a child and saw how they were growing up, and then saw the change that happened once they were exposed to social media, and then saw the rewriting of history, where they were telling me things that I knew were clearly not the case growing up. And so then I have the challenge as a parent to try to navigate allowing my child to be an individual and to start to develop autonomy and independence, but then also trying to navigate that with any parent who wants their child to be able to grow into who they are without the authoritarian, totalistic influence of outside forces that don't actually have their best interests at heart, but have an ideological conformity at heart. And so I got to experience a lot of the conflicts that I think a lot of parents have, where you're trying to give a child that freedom, but they are not trying to give you as a parent any measure of freedom. And they've transformed and have become somebody that you don't recognize, not as the part of normal teenage development, but through exposure to ideas in social media. And so I think that's where understanding the experience of detransitioners has become important, and being very cautious about taking an extreme perspective that tries to clamp down and not allow your child to explore their identity, and trying to find a balance that maintains connection is a struggle. And frankly, a lot of the online influences will even sabotage that and get them to see you as the enemy, and you just have to try to be a source of stability and consistency for your kid, and reinforce the idea that people do have some freedom of thought and existence that you can't impose on another person. So anyway, okay, well, let's see here. If we don't have any more calls, I think we'll go ahead and call this a day for today. And hopefully I'll be able to host a few more of these. I do want to try to open up space for parents to relate a little bit more of their experience. We've heard from a couple of parents today that I can find some resonance with my own experience and with the experience of others. I think in particular, understanding that a lot of the changes that we're seeing in the way that vulnerable kids experience gender dysphoria and what that then implies they should do in their lives comes from exposure to social media and exposure to ideas that are revolutionary and seem liberating, but we have yet to see what an individual's life and what a society's life will look like if you make those widespread and if you only affirm. And when you look at the rates of detransition that are out there, when you look at the problems of the medical paradigm of affirmation only that are going to be discovered more and more as we start to see lawsuits come up, and the medical institutions having to confront breaches of medical ethics that have gone into how these therapies have been implemented, I think we're going to start to have a better understanding of exactly what is happening. And if you want to get a sense of that, then just Google social contagion and look into other past social contagions. Look at how they've affected young women in particular. Look at how they've spread, understand some of those features, and then see how we're seeing the epidemiology of these ideas, this experience happen in the current world. And you have to realize there may be, and there probably is, a social contagion component of that, and we need to understand it, because we're doing some very, very dramatic, irreversible things to very vulnerable population. And we should just be very careful about that as the medical community and just as society at large. So, all right. Well, with that being said, we will go ahead and close out today. And then until next time, this has been Talk on Things and Stuff.